we left off talking about Kirtland Safety Society, and now we're going to talk about what's the impact on one quorum in the church, and our choice is going to be the Quorum of the 12. The Quorum of the 12, it's interesting that they were selected by the 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon. So who are our 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon? David Whitmer, Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris. So notice they are not selected by Joseph, but I've always thought it's pretty interesting. The 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon select the 12 men who are then apostles. The word apostle means one who is sent. So if you know an apostle and he's kicking back, sitting at home, you need to go, come on, you need to be out and about. You're one who is sent as they go then across the world to share the message of Jesus Christ. Now, as the 3 witnesses then to the Book of Mormon, oh, by the way, the dates that they will select these men, they will begin on February 14th of 1835. What's February 14th? Valentine's Day. And I've always said to my husband, so you didn't give me flowers again, no candy again on Valentine's Day, that's okay. It's still a good day. It's the day the Quorum of the 12 was called. Okay. So Quorum of the 12 then called on Valentine's Day, and as their names were called out, the first name called out was a man named Lyman Johnson, and Lyman Johnson at the time was 23 years old, and then all the names were called out. Joseph will then step forward and indicate that, yes, this is the Quorum of the 12, but Joseph will put them in seniority according to age. Okay, see what I'm saying? In other words, oldest to youngest. The oldest man of the 12 names called out was named Thomas who? Thomas B. Marsh, and he was 36 years old. So Thomas becomes the president, but here's the kind of interesting thing. Back then, birthdays weren't as big a deal as they are today. And David W. Patton actually didn't know when he was born. But if he had known his birthday, he was actually older than Thomas, and he could have been president. But so be it. Okay. But Thomas B. Marsh, he's 36 years old. Therefore, Thomas, you are president. And Lyman Johnson, although he was the first name called out, because he's 23, he's the youngest. So notice then the age of the Quorum of the 12, 36 down to 23. What's the difference between our current Quorum of the 12 today? Give or take how many years? He's saying 70, 50, 40, kind of thing. But you can also say less time in the church. They're called in 35. Thomas B. Marsh is coming in the year 1830. So you'd say the longest any of them had been a member of the church, maximum 5 years. Brigham Young comes in 1832, maximum 3 years, when he is called. So you'd say they are relatively young, and they're also young and experienced in the church. Now, I'm going to trust that we all know when their names were called out, they were great men. And they had already performed valiantly in the priesthood office that they had. And you'd say, initially, Thomas B. Marsh will make sure that each one of them serve a mission together to the eastern states, and they have great success. But then Thomas individually will give various assignments, including Brigham Young was asked to do what? Okay, builder on the Kirtland Temple, So various assignments, and you'd say it appeared that everything was going well in the quorum until the year 37. And 1837, suddenly you look at the quorum and you'd say things now start to go bad, and before we finish, 9 members of the quorum will have fallen. We're going to start first with Thomas B. Marsh, and the theme is Paul, and it's tragedy of, what was the name of the word Joseph called his town? Shinehaw. Okay, so Thomas B. Marsh, here goes. Thomas B. Marsh does not appear to have any issues as it relates to the Kirtland Safety Society banking company. But Thomas B. Marsh, as Joseph moves to Missouri, another state, Thomas will move there, and he lives in a town called Far West. As he lives in a town called Far West, he lives right next door to his neighbor, a man named George Washington, not the one we think of, George Washington, father of the country, but George Washington Harris. It turns out that Thomas B. Marsh's wife, Elizabeth, is a great friend with Lucinda Harris, the wife of this George W. Harris. They're such good friends that they decide, you know what let's do? Let's share our chores. In other words, one week, I'll milk all the cows, you get the week off. The next week, you milk the cows, and I'll do this and you do that. But the issue will come down to the cows. The conclusion was, as they shared the opportunities of milking the cows, that they would share equally something called the strippings. Okay, the strippings has to do everything with cream, and you realize the story then starts out a cholesterol problem and will only get worse. And so the plan is, if you share the strippings or of the cream part of the milking the cow, then you'll be able to make better cheese. Well, okay. One day, Thomas's wife comes to him and says, my friend is cheating me. In other words, she's holding back so that I can't make as good a cheese as she does. Thomas looks into the matter and concludes that he will take the wife of his neighbor to a church, a kind of disciplinary court. And so he takes her to the court of Newell K. Whitney, and as Bishop Whitney looks into the matter, his conclusion is, Thomas, if anybody's cheating, I think it could be your wife. Wow, Thomas is upset. He decides he's going to take it to the court of the stake president. In other words, I don't like that decision. I'm going to shop around. I'm going to get a better one. And so he takes it to the court of the stake president, and he goes, hey, you know, this neighbor is cheating my wife. Well, the stake president agrees with the bishop court. And the stake president says, basically, Thomas, if anybody's cheating, it's your wife. Oh, Thomas can't hear this, and he decides to take it to the court of the first presidency. Now, you know what we're talking about? We're talking about something real small here. Okay? You ever had something real small just get you? And it's just going up, 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 and finally Joseph now listens to it. He talks to Thomas about section 31 in the Doctrine and Covenants, where Thomas is to be mindful of his family, and Joseph then upholds what is said by all the other courts. The result is Thomas B. Marsh becomes very angry. So angry, he concludes that he will send a letter, or what was called an affidavit, to the governor of Missouri named Lilburn W. Boggs. Good. He sends a letter, affidavit, to Lilburn W. Boggs, and he accuses Joseph Smith of being a modern Mohammed, and that Joseph is arming 14,000 Indians, that Joseph is talking about there's a stone cut out with hands that will roll forth, fill the whole earth. And for Thomas B. Marsh, he's now indicating Joseph will do it in military mind and will roll forward and basically destroy the state of Missouri, if not the United States. For Lilburn W. Boggs, the governor, he'd been trying to figure out what to do with the Mormon question. He'd received a lot of word from different places, but suddenly a letter from the leader of the Quorum of the 12, his conclusion is he issues a what? Extermination order. In other words, the saints must be exterminated like Native Americans had been, or driven from the state. Well, what happens to Thomas B. Marsh after this? Obviously, Thomas B. Marsh loses his membership. And, okay, we're going to now follow him for the next 18 years of his life. When he loses his membership, obviously he's out of the church. And for the next 18 years, he wanders through 5 different states, and he attempts to support himself as a school teacher. I can speak to the fallacy of that, okay? But nevertheless, he tries to support himself as a school teacher, and his very favorite subject to teach was biblical geography. Now, you realize that's not a standing room only class here, and especially it's not a standing room only class being taught by someone who's never seen, over there. Let me tell you about the hills and the rocks, and and you're like, have you ever seen it? Well, okay, you'd say, what's Thomas B. Marsh going through? He's going through poverty. Adding to it, his wife will leave him and will take the children. So you'd say, wow, Thomas, what's happened to you? You've lost your family, you've lost any sense of financial base, and adding to it, he loses his health. He contracts a horrible disease called palsy, and he begins to shake. And sometimes he has the disease under control, other times he does not. But as he begins to shake, sometimes he can't even hold a fork in his hand. Finally, he concludes, I made a horrible mistake many years ago. Now, I trust it will not take any of us 18 years. Okay, where you go? Well, I made a mistake. Okay. But finally, 18 years later, he concludes, I've got to find this Lucinda Harris. And I've got to tell Lucinda that my wife was cheating. That on this milk and cream thing, I blew it, okay. So Thomas now works his way out to Iowa. When he arrives in Iowa, several saints were living there, including this husband, now a widower, George Washington Harris. And for George, he is now serving on his 5th High Council. It's like he has High Councilman stamped on his forehead, and here comes his old neighbor, Thomas B. Marsh. And Thomas, when he knocks on George's door, he says he's come a long way and he's come to see Lucinda. George said that he'd like to see her too, but she's been dead for years. Well, Thomas is very upset. He indicates that he wanted to apologize, and George is actually surprised that Thomas has held on to it for so long because he said, Lucinda and I forgave you years ago. In other words, here you are, kind of guilt-wrecked with it, but in the case of the other family, they had forgiven and kind of moved on. Well, to show the sense of forgiveness, George will now take Thomas into his home. He will clothe him, he will feed him, and finally one day, Thomas says he would like the God of Israel to be his God again. In other words, I would like to be baptized. Well, okay. Thomas B. Marsh will be baptized out there in the Missouri River, but after he's baptized, people began to wonder, was his baptism any good? After all, his crime was more than the milk issue now. His crime, he wrote the letter, it went to Boggs. Boggs issues an extermination order. People are hurt, they're homeless, they've lost this and that, and so the conclusion was that they didn't know whether his baptism was really any good because he'd repented of one crime, but what about the other? And so the people in Iowa took up a collection. Now, notice it's the very same group that are trying to save to get their oxen and their wagons ready to go, but they take up a collection to send Thomas B. Marsh now to Utah to be able to see Brigham Young. Well, okay, here comes Thomas B. Marsh to Utah. He's in the back of somebody's wagon. He arrives, he's taken to Brigham Young, and Brigham Young does not recognize the man. Okay, notice Brigham Young, at his call, Thomas is 36, Brigham Young is 34. And he sees his old quorum president, he doesn't recognize him. And he said, if you are Thomas, he said, speak to me for a moment so I'll know it's you. And so Thomas spoke, and Brigham said, truly, it must be you. Thomas, you are the only man I've ever known that can chit-chat about nothing. In other words, come on, buddy. Okay. And Thomas wants to know, can the God of Israel be my God? And Brigham says, I don't know. He said, come to conference and sit on the stand. Well, okay. Everybody's gathering into, the old kind of tabernacle Bowery kind of thing. As they're gathering in, Thomas is on the stand, and Brigham Young now stands up, and his topic is, he wants to remind everyone about our suffering in the state of Missouri. And he wants to know, who lost family, and who lost property, and where are you out there? And he wants to remind everybody that, oh, truly, Governor Boggs and his men, but the man that pulled the trigger, Thomas B. Marsh. He then announced that you probably wonder who's seated on the stand. Well, it's Thomas. Now, you realize people back then, much more vocal than we are. I think we save it for sports outings or, concerts, but suddenly, boy, some had really bad feelings about this man for years. Brigham Young then stands up. He has Thomas stand next to him, and he said, Thomas and I are about the same age. And he said, he then describes himself as being physically fit. And then he says, Thomas is a withered old man. And he said, that is what happens when you lose the Holy Ghost. Now, with that, Thomas has been introduced. Tell me, would you ever like an introduction like that from a prophet? Would you ever want to do that to your face, to your body? He's a withered old man. And, okay. Thomas now stands up and actually says something I think is pretty neat. He said, the Lord, to try and explain this palsy, this shaking he has. He said, the Lord loved me enough that he wouldn't let me go without a severe shaking. And that's how he explains, his shaking. He then apologizes. He says he would like the God of Israel to be his God. Brigham Young stands up and he wants to know, where are those that can forgive this man? Now, to the credit, and there are hundreds of people there, who have, many of them have had bad feelings about Thomas for, decade plus. And to the credit of the congregation, they voted unanimous to accept the man back in. Okay, you'd say for Thomas, he's rebaptized, he receives his endowments, and you'd say, well, Thomas, during the rest of his life, there will be vacancies in the Quorum of the 12. Is he ever considered? What would you say? No. And you go, oh, Thomas, you came back, but guess what? The blessings, the opportunities, that could have been yours and your family, you'd say, well, he lost out, and he lost out over something so simple. What was it? The strippings of this cream and milk. You're like, heck, some people are actually allergic to milk. Okay, like, who cares? It's just not a big issue. It's not something to blow you out of the saddle. Okay. So, well, you can see the Western influence. When I say saddle, you're always going, what? I go, oh, the Cowboy Indians. Okay, Thomas, we've done him. If we were to look at the next three, we would describe them always faithful. And so, I won't take so long, but David W. Patton, to show his faithfulness. David W. Patton, one example. At one point, there will be a battle in the state of Missouri. And prior to the battle, he will be heard to have said to Joseph Smith, I love the Lord so much I will give my life for his cause. And Joseph said to him, oh, David, don't say that out loud. The Lord loves you enough, he's going to take you up on it. Well, sure enough, in the battle, he is wounded. He's brought to his home, and people are trying to give him priesthood blessings. He then says, I see angels, and tells his wife to be faithful, and he's gone. In Revelation, you can find the Lord saying, David W. Patton is with me now. And you go, oh, wow, okay, I like that one. Okay. For Brigham Young, we can find him all over the place. Continual faithfulness. The very first day that Joseph Smith will meet Brigham Young, they go into a meeting there in Kirtland. Brigham has arrived in town with no shoes on. He's incredibly poor. Joseph, in a meeting, will ask Brigham to stand and introduce himself. Brigham, as he stands to kind of introduce himself to those present, suddenly he speaks in tongues, and people are like, what is that? At which point Joseph then stands up and he says, it's the first time I've ever heard a mortal speak the Adamic tongue. In other words, speak Adam's language. This man has just told me he will live to lead the church. Okay, so you start to look. Heber C. Kimball, you see as faithful all the time. And you look and you say, okay, we're now down to a man named Orson Hyde with the idea the rest of them will all then, at some point in their life, fall, and many coming back. Orson Hyde is a pretty interesting story and actually pretty tragic. Orson Hyde, in the midst of the Kirtland Safety Society, Joseph Smith will go to Heber C. Kimball, right above Orson Hyde in the Quorum of the 12, and will say to Heber, I want to call you on a mission to England. In other words, middle of the Kirtland Safety Society disaster, I don't need you here. You're an apostle. Head to England, spread the gospel. For Heber C. Kimball, he wanted to take Brigham Young, his best friend from Menden, New York. He wanted to take Brigham and said, can I take Brigham with me? And Joseph says, no, take Orson Hyde. So Orson Hyde and Heber C. Kimball, amidst the Kirtland Safety Society, they head out now to England and share the gospel. Now, when they come home, the saints have moved to Missouri, and if you were to say, who is Orson Hyde's best friend? Well, it was our guide, Thomas B. Marsh. Normally, you would say, a best friend, president of the Quorum of the 12, way to choose a great friend. However, when Orson Hyde comes home from his mission, he's not feeling very well, and he goes to see his best friend. Now, I know for myself, when I don't feel well, it's really hard to feel the Spirit. But as he goes to see Thomas B. Marsh says, hey, I'm writing this letter to Lilburn W. Boggs about Joseph Smith and martyring Mohammed and arming Indians. Will you sign your name with me? And Orson Hyde says yes. Okay, wow, you look, you go, Orson, wow, you've just been an amazing missionary. You've done all these great things. And suddenly Orson Hyde has a co-signature with Thomas B. Marsh. Well, okay, you realize their crime is basically the same. I mean, you take out the cream, right? But the signatures, no doubt about it, it's the same. Well, the difference, what you're going to find, well, the same means they both what? Lose their membership, right? I mean, the crime is the same. The difference is time to repent. Okay, and that's a huge message. How many years did it take Thomas B. Marsh to want to come back? 18. You guys aren't old enough. 18 years, oh my, never take that long. So the crime is the same. For Orson Hyde, he loses his membership. And you say for Orson Hyde, he pretty much wanders. But lucky for Orson Hyde, he had the right missionary companion. And all of you have got to hope you've had that great of companion. I know I have, my husband. I know he pulled me back, Okay, watch this. Orson Hyde, he's now wandering, and going to find him is his old missionary companion, Heber C. Kimball. And he finds him depressed. He is really just, can hardly live with himself. And Heber C. Kimball says, you come, you stay with me, and when Joseph makes it over here now to another state called Illinois, and will eventually escape from a Liberty jail setup, he said, we'll see Joseph together. So finally, Joseph escapes from a jail, and as he does so, he's now in Illinois, and coming to see him will be Heber C. Kimball, always faithful. But also coming will be Orson Hyde. When Joseph sees Orson Hyde, he says to him, he said, I have waded through an ocean of tribulation because of you. In other words, it's like he's going for his jugular. I've waded through an ocean of tribulation, and he said, it was you that put me there. In other words, you were the one. He doesn't credit it to Thomas B. Marsh. He doesn't credit it to Boggs. He says to Orson, you did it. At which point, Joseph will then forgive Orson and will baptize him and place Orson back in the Quorum of the 12. Okay, now, what's the impact? Okay, I think this is pretty interesting. Orson Hyde will then continue to serve in the Quorum of the 12. He will actually go over to the land we call Israel today, to Jerusalem, and dedicate that land for the return of the Jews. But, and you'd say he'd be president of the Quorum of the 12. You know, Heber C. Kimball dies, and he's president of the Quorum of the 12 for 20 plus years. And then in the year 1875, it's about a year and a half before Brigham Young, then president of the church, dies, he calls in Orson Hyde. And he says to Orson Hyde, I've been thinking about the years 1837-38. Tell me, is Orson going to forget this? No. You know, you have an impact experience, you're going to hold it. It may not hurt as it did at first, but you're not going to forget. And probably the good part is maybe you won't do it again. But he calls him in and he says, hey, I've been thinking about the years 1837-38. Orson Hyde says, I repent. And let me tell you the wonderful things I've done. At which point Brigham says, I know that. But during those few short months you were out of the quorum, we put in a man who has served longer in seniority in that quorum with faithfulness. Can you name him? Good, John Taylor. Fabulous. So you'd say, when Brigham Young dies, who becomes president of the church? Is it Orson Hyde? You'll quickly notice John Taylor is not in the original Quorum of the 12. And I'd say, what can you always guarantee? The man who becomes in the prophet, you look at his track record, and you'd say his faithfulness, he is a constant. So even though Orson Hyde, only out a short time, you'd say, you know, an opportunity obviously missed. Okay.